This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at BakerStreetIrregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the band was speckled and there were 6 Napoleons, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about why Dr. Watson was called James by his wife? Or of Sherlock Holmes's dining habits? Or what happened when he let a criminal escape?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 207, The Care and Feeding of Sherlock Holmes. Hello, 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 and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into some of the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, I hope you're hungry.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Are you going to eat all that donut? Could you just...
I'll fax it over to you. Can I fax the donut to you?
Yeah, please do.
Excellent. Teletype coming through. Well, this is episode 207. As we mentioned, you can find the show notes for this episode at ihose.co/trifles207, which will take you right to SherlockHolmesPodcast.com to this specific episode. If you would like to comment on it there, go right ahead. If you'd like to send us an email, we would welcome your email. We are trifles at ihearofsherlock.com. And if you haven't done so yet, check out our other podcast, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where twice a month we interview notable or simply interesting Sherlockians, people who are doing interesting things in the world of Sherlock Holmes. Well, Bert, we're going to talk about the care and feeding of Sherlock Holmes. Now, this is not the first time we've covered things related to food in the canon. Previously, I think on episode 42, yeah, 42, we talked about the supper that Sherlock Holmes laid out in The Noble Bachelor, which he called a quite Epicurean little cold supper. If you haven't had an opportunity to listen to that, just follow it to ihose.co/trifles42 or just get on down to, gosh, I guess that was season 1 of our program in, must have been sometime in the fall of that year, October of 2017. But we want to talk about a paper. This is the third episode of the month. It is the typical episode where we all year long have looked at an old piece of Sherlockian scholarship. We call this the Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist series, where we look at old theories. And in this case, we're looking back to a piece that appeared in 221B, Studies in Sherlock Holmes by Vincent Starrett. This is the book Starrett put together in 1940, which... was this like one of the first Sherlockian anthology works of scholarship, Bert?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the first.
Well, H.W. Bell did another one too.
There were actually a series of sort of seminal things bubbling up in the 30s by people like, Finley Crisp was also in the 30s too, wasn't it? But certainly this is a collection of essays, and it's certainly one of the seminal early gatherings of scholarship. And it came at around a time when the idea of a regular recurring journal of Sherlockian papers and things was becoming more of an idea, and was announced in that, that famous dinner, right?
Yeah. Yeah. What was it? This was included in the the trilogy dinner. We had,
Right.
it was Profiled by Gaslight. It was The Misadventures of Sherlock Holmes. And, or was it Morley's Holmes and Watson that,
Maybe you're
appeared
right.
there? Because this Starrett book was in 1940, but it was one that really cemented the relationship, between some of those early, Sherlockians. And in this case, you had Morley and Elmer Davis, contributing, H.W. Bell, as I mentioned, and of course, Starrett himself. But the one we wanted to, look at that. Sherlock Holmes in Pictures by Frederick Dorr Steele, on page 129. We, of course, talked about Frederick Dorr Steele on episode 204 of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. So there's a nice tie-in there. But the paper that we are interested in, this time around, it's a short one, is by Earl F. Walbridge. I keep wanting to call him Earl Stanley Walbridge.
Perry Walbridge.
What you didn't, did you, Mr. Monty? No, I didn't, Mr. Mason. So Earl F. Walbridge, has this paper that says, that Sherlock Holmes basically had, a particular interest in, all things food related, although he didn't show it oftentimes. There are two quotes that start the beginning of the paper. One is from the Yellow Face. His diet was usually of the sparest. And the other from Watson in The Valley of Fear said, he sat with his mouth full of toast and his eyes sparkling with mischief, watching my intellectual entanglement. The mere sight of his excellent appetite was an assurance of success, for I had very clear recollections of days and nights without a thought of food, when his baffled mind had chafed before some problem, while his thin, eager features became more attenuated with the asceticism of a complete mental concentration.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't remember that so close or being integral to the high tea scene there, where Watson is so gratified at seeing Holmes eat. But certainly the vast majority of encounters we have around Holmes and food are ones in which he is not eating or avoiding. And that's one of the reasons why the literal handful of cases where food is somehow celebratory, stand out in such high relief in the canon.
Yeah. And, the times when he did eat, or when he planned to eat, he, I think it was in The Sign of Four. Mrs. Hudson asked him when he would be pleased to dine, and he said, I think 7:30 the day after tomorrow, or something like that.
Yeah, I think that wasn't that from the Mazarin Stone, though?
Oh, it could be.
But yeah, I remember that. And I think that's one of the things that Earl Walbridge mentions in his paper. It's a charming paper. It comes, as I say, at this time in the 1940s when these things are being gathered. And in fact, in 221B, Studies in Sherlock Holmes, you also have a piece that Christopher Morley wrote for, I think, the Saturday Review, Was Sherlock Holmes an American, and so on. So you have this great gathering of things. And Walbridge goes through the appearance of many of the appearances, most of the appearances of food in the canon. He says there are 24 references to breakfast in the naval treaty, which has this famous breakfast scene, the great reveal. There's curried chicken, ham, eggs, toast, coffee. I think Walbridge mentions that in Lady Frances Carfax, Holmes is thinking ahead and sends a cable from Montpelier to Mrs. Hudson. And he may have had dinner in mind, but it was around some sort of a meal, I think. And Watson frequently observes, as he just did in this quotation, that Holmes's encounter with food or life in Baker Street didn't have regular meals as a characteristic of it. He says there's never any guarantee that breakfast, if we happen to have it, would be followed by the usual sequence of meals. And in the Boscombe Valley case, they missed breakfast altogether.
Well, that was not uncommon, as you said. The scenes of them kind of dashing off from Baker Street to hail a cab or off to Paddington Station to pick up a train somewhere. There was one that stood out to me that I really never, I never really paid attention to, and it was in a scene in The Golden Pince-Nez. This, of course, is when Stanley Hopkins, young Stanley Hopkins, the promising Stanley Hopkins, comes to Baker Street, and it's raining cats and dogs. He's got his galoshes and everything, and he begins to tell them the story about what was going on out at Yoxley Old Place. And Holmes did a really interesting thing. He said, well, it's nearly 1:00 in the morning, and I think we need to make an early start. And Hopkins said something about the train tables. Let's see. He said, if it's not asking too much, Mr. Holmes, because Holmes said, I suppose you want us to come out tomorrow. He said, if it's not asking too much, there's a train from Charing Cross to Chatham at 6 a.m, and we should be at Yoxley Old Place between 8 and 9. And then Holmes says, then we will take it. Your case has certainly some features of great interest, and I shall be delighted to look into it. Well, it's nearly 1, and we'd best get a few hours sleep. I dare say you can manage all right on the sofa in front of the fire. I'll light my spirit lamp and give you a cup of coffee before we start. Now that little nugget right there, which Walbridge called out, is just a wonderful nugget of Holmes taking care of his guest, his overnight guest. Almost like this is 221 Airbnb, supplying him with a freshly made cup of coffee in the room. No sense in having to wake Mrs. Hudson at whatever ungodly hour to prepare a coffee so we can drink it and then be off to Charing Cross in time to catch our 6:00 train.
Well, too, also, we know Holmes from the very first moment we see him that he's familiar with the laboratory. He has a chemical laboratory. And I don't know that it's the case, but in this pre-Keurig, pre-Mr. Coffee era, I would think it would be fairly common for you in the lab rather than to go someplace else if you really wanted a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. Light your spirit lamp, light your Bunsen burner, and heat it up. And so heat up the water. And so it's very in line with that. But the interesting thing about all this, and we do want to go through some of these things that that Earl Walbridge mentions, including Henry Baker's goose, which is sort of an appearance of food. But one of the things that struck me is I suddenly asked myself, I don't know if anybody's ever written a paper asking, did Sherlock Holmes have an eating disorder? And the interesting thing is that when you talk about eating disorders, a lot of people immediately think of anorexia and nervosa and things like that. But there are other eating disorders, including one that's sort of characterized by, I don't know how you would call it. I mean, eating too little to maintain the body. And I think it is called, cause I had just thought about looking this. Oh yeah. A restrictive food intake disorder. And, it's generally characterized by avoidance or restriction of food intake that prevents the person from eating sufficient calories or eating habits that interfere with normal social functions, such as eating with others. It's interesting, isn't it, that there are only a handful of people that Holmes regularly eats with. Watson, Athelney Jones, this sort of event around the naval treaty. And I'm just wondering about that. And I had looked up on the National Institutes of Health in terms of causes of eating disorders. And one causal factor is genetics. And apparently there's been a study that shows if one twin develops an eating disorder, the other has a 50% likelihood of developing one too on average. And I'm wondering if there's something there in terms of the contrast between Mycroft and Holmes around eating disorders.
Well, I mean, Mycroft was 7 years older than Sherlock. And it, as the older brother, and the more, aggressive one at the table, he could have easily absconded with most of the meal and the trimmings before young Sherlock had a chance to rouse himself from whatever reverie he was in, whatever book he had his nose in, or scrapbook he was forming, or microscope he was looking into. And there and behold, we have the formation, literally, the formation of Mycroft.
I like that. He had a 7-year head start in eating.
Right.
Holmes.
And he kept it up. No. Well, the other thing, I really think your supposition about eating disorders is an interesting one. I never really considered that before. But my wife and I, we both have very different approaches to food. She and our middle child both get hangry. You've heard of the term hangry. It's the anger that comes on out of being hungry, low blood sugar, and it leads to people getting impatient or lashing out or snippy. You can tell I'm completely unfamiliar with this. But on the other hand, my proclivity is to just completely lose sight of the need to eat because I've got my head down and I'm working on something. And it's not like, my stomach is, constantly growling at me or aching or anything. I don't pay attention to it. And I really identified with Holmes. I mean, I don't go more than a day without eating. I'll miss a meal. If anything, that's it. I'll miss lunch. But I identified with this whole, situation he would find himself in where he would just forget to eat.
Yeah, me too. My attitude towards eating is very similar. I mean, I like to look forward to meals. I like to cook. I find them very celebratory. But most days these days, I have very little or nothing for breakfast. I won't have a lunch. I'll have somewhere along the line in the middle of the afternoon, I'll have something to eat. But then, in this pandemic environment, we're not burning up a lot of calories.
True, but Bert, I'm going to channel your mother here and say, you're looking too thin. I want you to eat more. Well, we're going to take this quick break. Bert's going to have a nosh, and we'll be back in just a few moments. Yes, we're in the middle of one of those Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist episodes of Trifles, where we're looking at a classic piece of Sherlockian scholarship. Well, where can you find classic Sherlockian scholarship? Well, there are a couple of places, and we can think of one of them right off the bat that's available right now. It's The Grand Game, Volume 2, which contains Sherlockian scholarship from a variety of sources, mostly the Baker Street Journal, from 1960 to 2010. Volume 2 is all that's left because Volume 1 was so popular, it sold out. We'll have more news on bringing Volume 1 back from the dead in future episodes. But for now, get on over to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and pick up your copy of Volume 2 of The Grand Game, covering the last half-century of Sherlockian scholarship. You won't find better work in a single volume anywhere else. Go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and get The Grand Game Volume 2 today. Okay, we are back talking about Sherlock Holmes, the care and feeding of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Now, as we were talking about Holmes's Spartan appetite there, I was reminded of the scene in The Hound of the Baskervilles where Watson comes upon, one of these old stone huts, and he walks inside and he finds a can of preserved tinned tongue, and a couple of cans of tinned peaches. And I never really thought of that as appetizing, but then again I thought, well, you needed something that was portable, something that would, be able to be left out, over a period of whatever he was there, 4 days, I guess. It was practical. I can't imagine that that Holmes actually enjoyed that kind of food. But he knew how to survive in a pinch.
Wasn't some of it untouched? Weren't the peaches untouched?
Yeah, they were unopened tins of peaches.
Well, it certainly is odd. I mean, in The Hound, though, there's some point where he asks somebody to get him a loaf of bread. Isn't that in The Hound?
Well, he mentions to Watson, a loaf of bread, a clean collar. What more could a man want?
Oh, right, that's it.
And he was having his needs looked after by evidently a Dartmoor version of Billy who would run to the dry cleaner and get his shirts.
Wasn't there like a reference to Cartwright there?
Cartwright, that's right. It was Cartwright. Yeah, so Cartwright would do the dry cleaner run. I can just imagine him with the hanger and the plastic streaming over his shoulder as he's running throughout the Grimpen mire.
Now, I imagine he came back to the stone hut and gave Holmes his tin of tongue and canned peaches. And Holmes looked at this and said, "Cartwright, what's this?" And he said, "Well, Mr. Holmes, you gave me 19 shillings. This is all they had that I could bring back."
So I could do with it, But to your point, the fact that they were untouched makes you wonder, well, what else did Holmes get through?
No, but you're missing the point. Oh, this is another lovely thing that could turn into a paper. Poor Cartwright, poor Holmes forgot the can opener. Cartwright, you are never going to go far in this profession.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, Mr. Holmes, you didn't say anything about no can opener.
Oh, if only Captain Crocker and his multiplex knife were here.
That's right.
Good Lord. No, I can just imagine Holmes just looking at the tins and saying, well, I'm not going to expend what little energy I have with a rock trying to smash these tins open. I'd rather go hungry. Oh.
It's a strange thing, Dr. Watson, but in addition to all these mysterious happenings in the evening out on the moor, I've discovered the smell of peaches apparently wafting in. Sound of hammers coming from those stone huts and cursing. I believe I hear cursing.
Oh, but from Walbridge's paper is a section here on Holmes's likes and dislikes of vegetables. He apparently considered an even worse horror than the Cornish horror. He knew nothing of practical gardening and evidently cared less. Some experience with British beetroot, vegetable marrow, or boiled potato must have seared his soul. Now, the roast beef of old England was something else again. He once repaired to Simpson's in the Strand to recoup his energies with a cut off the joint, and a cold side of beef always reposed on the sideboard. And the pseudo-landlady, Mrs. Turner, makes her sole appearance in the saga with a tray of beef and beer. So Holmes, as a true Englishman, certainly must have loved his beef.
Well, in his paper about Holmes being an American, Morley uses as evidence, one of his evidentiary points is Holmes never eats fish. And so, therefore, says Morley, if I remember that correctly, he couldn't have been English. But yes, I mean, beef, Simpsons in the Strand, a cold roast of beef always on the sideboard, a cold joint of beef available on the sideboard, hastily made sandwiches. What could be better than good old British beef? But it is interesting, and Walbridge doesn't point this out, I don't think, in the paper, that Holmes, well, he eats shellfish, in terms of oysters, and he talks about oysters, but,
right.
We never hear anybody enjoying any trout or anything from the streams.
That's true. Never really thought about that. Walbridge mentions that Holmes didn't refuse Mrs. Sinclair's cold supper at the Cedars in Kent, where a large and comfortable double-bedded room had been placed at their disposal, and Watson was quickly between the sheets. Watson valued his sleep, and Holmes enjoyed the supper. And here's what I one of the things that I really enjoy about the canon, when Holmes is able to rib Watson occasionally, and Walbridge says, at times Holmes would twit his faithful companion humorously, attributing to him his own shortcomings. By Jove, my dear fellow, he exclaimed, it is nearly 9, and the landlady babbled of green peas at 7:30. What with your eternal tobacco, Watson, and your irregularity at meals, I expect you will get notice to quit, and that I shall be and that I shall share your downfall.
Yeah, that is charming. It really is charming.
That, of course, is from The Three Students. But then he would regale the doctor with coffee and a curacao at Goldini's in Kensington, which, of course, the Bruce Partington plans, or with carboniferous roast goose. Roast goose. Even then, he postponed the feast from dinner to supper time. And that was Henry Baker's bird that Holmes was only too happy to dine on. Yeah. Well, what with Christmas coming up, Bert, what are your thoughts on a roast goose?
Well, we talked about that occasion from time to time. I did make a roast goose once for Christmas dinner several years ago, and the experience was such that it's never going to be repeated. It just wasn't worth it. And of course, the friends of Irene Adler, when they would meet, which they're not doing this year in December, in Boston, one of their traditional menu items is a roast goose. And that, I think, is probably the best goose that one, could possibly have. But, I don't know. I guess I'm traditional enough to always look forward to turkey, even though it comes on the heel of Thanksgiving. Although what we're going to actually have, it's odd, you should mention this because we've just decided that we're going to have roast duck, which we also usually do. We like to do a roast duck for Christmas.
Well, I think the conclusion is the same, that if you're going to enjoy some goose or being goosed, make sure you do it with others. And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Bear up, man! You'll be in the fire. What a wretched little shrimp it is, to be sure.